In the middle of the 14th century, people went to bed healthy and woke up dying. It began with a shiver. Then a fever that struck like a physical blow. Within hours, dark, pulsing swellings, the buboes, would appear under the arms and along the neck. By the third day, the skin turned black with gangrene. By the fifth, you were a memory. In cities like Florence and Paris, the bells rang so often that they eventually stopped. There was no more room in the graveyards. There were no more tears for the dead. Across Europe, a single terrifying question echoed through every empty street. Is this the end of the world? What they didn't realize was that they were witnessing the deadliest biological event in recorded human history. A pandemic that would erase up to 50% of Europe's population and permanently rewrite the DNA of civilization. This is the story of the Black Death, and once it began, there was no escape. The apex of humanity. To understand how hard humanity fell, we must first understand the height from which it collapsed. The early 14th century wasn't a time of darkness. It was a golden era of stability, the High Middle Ages. Thanks to the medieval warm period, harvests were bountiful. Population had doubled. Trade was booming. A merchant in Venice could buy silk from the edges of Asia. It was the medieval World Wide Web. Spices, gold, and ideas moved with unprecedented speed. But this interconnectedness was a double-edged sword. The very roads that brought wealth were about to deliver the greatest executioner in history. The infrastructure for a global apocalypse was perfectly laid out. The ecology of a monster. The origin of the apocalypse lay thousands of miles from Paris, in the vast windswept steppes of Central Asia. Here, a silent killer had waited for millennia, Yersinia pestis. For centuries, this bacterium lived in an ecological balance with marmots and ground squirrels. But in the 1330s, the climate shifted. Severe droughts followed by heavy rains devastated the rodent food sources. Hungry, infected rodents began migrating closer to human Silk Road outposts. The leap from animal to human happened in the shadows of merchant caravans. News traveled slowly, but rumors traveled faster. By 1340, terrifying reports reached Mediterranean ports. Stories of entire Eastern civilizations vanishing into reigns of fire and pestilence. The Europeans listened with detachment. They thought it was a divine punishment for foreigners. They didn't realize that the spices on their tables had traveled the same road as their death warrant run. The birth of biological warfare. The geographical pivot point of this catastrophe was the city of Caffa, a fortified Genoese colony on the Crimean Peninsula. In 1346, Caffa was under siege by the Golden Horde, led by Khan Johnny Beg. For months, it was a stalemate. But then, a silent killer began to stalk the Mongol camp. Soldiers weren't dying from arrows. They were dying from biology. Facing defeat and watching his army dissolve, Johnny Beg made a decision that would haunt history forever. He ordered the plague-ridden corpses of his soldiers to be loaded onto trebuchets. For days, the sky over Caffa rained dead bodies. The Genoese watched in horror as pestilent corpses smashed onto their roofs. It was the first recorded act of large-scale biological warfare. The fortress hadn't been breached by soldiers. It had been infiltrated by fleas. Panic gripped the city. 12 Genoese galleys loaded with refugees and unseen stowaways slipped out of the harbor, fleeing for home. They were heading for Messina, Sicily, but they weren't bringing silk or spices. They were bringing the end of the world. The death ships of Messina. In October 1347, the people of Messina saw a nightmare approaching from the horizon. 12 Genoese galleys fleeing the horror of Caffa limped into the port. But when the dock workers climbed aboard to greet the merchants, they found a scene from hell. Most of the sailors were already dead, their bodies rotting on the decks. The few who still drew breath were delirious, their bodies covered in oozing black boils that dripped blood and pus. The smell of decay was so overpowering it could be caught from the shore. The authorities in Messina realized too late what they were looking at. They ordered the ships expelled immediately. But the true executioners didn't need permission to stay. The black rats, ubiquitous on every medieval ship, used the mooring ropes to scurry onto the docks. On their backs, they carried the Xenopsilla chaopus, the oriental rat flea. As the rats died from the infection, the fleas jumped to the nearest warm host, humans. Messina was the test case for Europe, and it failed. Within weeks, the city's social fabric disintegrated. People fled to the countryside, unknowingly carrying the invisible fire with them. The failure of science. To understand the terror of the 14th century, we must realize that humanity was fighting an enemy they couldn't see and a war they couldn't understand. There was no germ theory, no microscopes. The best minds of the age, the doctors of the University of Paris, were baffled. Their framework was based on the ancient theory of humors and miasma. They believed the air itself had turned poisonous. In 1345, 3 years before the plague hit France, there was a specific planetary alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. To the medieval mind, this wasn't an astronomical event. It was a cosmic catastrophe that released noxious vapors from the Earth. Every rational attempt to stop the plague only accelerated the dying. Doctors advised people not to bathe, fearing that water opened the pores to the corrupted air. They burned rosemary and juniper on street corners to mask the scent of death. They bled patients who were already dangerously weak. They even lanced the buboes, which only served to spread the septicemic infection directly into the bloodstream. By 1348, the plague reached Florence, the jewel of the Renaissance. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed the collapse firsthand. He described a world where the most sacred bonds of humanity were severed like brittle thread. Fathers abandoned sons. Wives left their husbands to die alone in their beds. The terror of contagion was so absolute that people became ghosts to one another while they were still alive. The sound of the city changed. The bustling markets, the shouting merchants, the construction, all gone. It was replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the constant tolling of church bells. When the bell ringers themselves died, the silence became total. Consecrated ground overflowed. In London and Paris, massive trenches were dug. Bodies were stacked in layers like cordwood, with a thin dusting of soil between them. In the 14th century, there was no distinction between the physical and the spiritual. If you died without your last rites and were buried like an animal in a pit, your soul was lost forever. This was the ultimate terror, the wrath of God and the scapegoats. In the 14th century, there was no line between the physical and the spiritual. If the world was dying, it could only mean one thing: God was angry. As prayers failed and the church's best priests died alongside the sinners, a desperate, radical piety emerged from the smoke. These were the flagellants, bands of hundreds of men dressed in identical robes, marched from town to town. Twice a day, they would strip to the waist in public squares and whip themselves with iron-tipped scourges. They hoped that by taking the sins of the world right onto their own bleeding flesh, they could appease God's wrath. But they brought more than religious hysteria. They brought the infection itself, moving from village to village as biological vectors of the very plague they were trying to stop. But as the death toll reached 200 million across Eurasia, the need for a tangible enemy grew darker. If God wasn't listening, perhaps the devil was at work. A horrific conspiracy theory took root, that the Jewish communities were poisoning the wells to wipe out Christendom. Despite Pope Clement VI pointing out that Jews were dying from the plague at the same rate as everyone else, the mob mentality was unstoppable. In cities like Strasbourg and Cologne, entire communities were rounded up and burned alive. The Black Death unleashed not just biological horror, but the darkest, most predatory instincts of human nature. The Great Leveler, the economic revolution. By 1350, the plague reached the frozen north, Scotland, Scandinavia, and even the remote outposts of Greenland. The fog of death began to lift only when the bacteria simply ran out of victims. But the Europe that emerged was a ghost of its former self. 50% of the population was gone. In the immediate aftermath, there was chaos. But then something remarkable happened. For centuries, the peasant had been a slave to the land, a serf trapped in the rigid hierarchy of feudalism. But suddenly, labor was the scarcest resource on earth. Lords were desperate. Their harvests were rotting. Their lands were turning back into wilderness. For the first time in history, the peasant held the power. They demanded higher wages. They demanded freedom to move. They demanded the end of serfdom. The rigid structures of the High Middle Ages didn't just crack, they shattered. This was the birth of the golden age of the laborer. From the ashes of the plague, the middle class began its slow, painful climb to power. The dance of death, cultural legacy. The psychological scars changed the very DNA of Western art and thought. The obsession with death, the dance macabre, became the dominant motif. It was a stark reminder that death was the ultimate equalizer. Whether you wore a crown or a rag, the skeleton waited for everyone. This cynicism led to a questioning of authority. If the church couldn't save you and the king couldn't protect you, perhaps you had to look for answers elsewhere. This shift in perspective from the divine to the human cleared the intellectual ground for the Renaissance. The Black Death was a forest fire for civilization. It was devastating, yes, but it cleared the old, stagnant growth to make room for something new. The conclusion, the echo of the past. For centuries, we treated the Black Death as a distant medieval nightmare. But think about it. Empty streets, locked homes, fear of the very air we breathe. Does that sound like ancient history to you? The plague was the ultimate test of human systems. It proved that our interconnectedness is our greatest strength, but also our greatest vulnerability. History isn't just a record of what happened, it's a warning of what can happen again. We study the past so we can survive the future. If you want to explore more about the resilient people who survived the apocalypse, check out our deep dive on the painted people of Scotland in the link below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep history reborn. I'm Lost Origins, watching the past to understand the present. I'll see you in the next era.